to a journey through the streets of Paris, looking for the history of mime. I'm your host, T. Daniel. Today's journey is going to begin at the corner of Rue Molière and Rue de Richelieu, because there is a fountain, Molière, dedicated in 1844. It contains 2 tablets that list all of the plays that Molière did. And it took, you're probably wondering why, if we're looking for the history of mime, we are beginning with Molière. Because as far as I know, Molière never wrote a mime play. He was not a mime himself, so why begin with Molière? Because on February 15, 1665, Molière presented a play, Don Juan ou le Festin de Pierre. In that play, during the second act, out walked a character dressed in white in peasant's clothes that changed the history of theater and changed the history of mime. And that character was Pierrot. And Molière was responsible for giving life to that character. Now, late in Molière's life, he moved into an apartment in the building right across the street where this fountain now stands. And when he died in 1673, he was living in those apartments. We're going to take a walk now down Rue de Richelieu till we come to Place Colette. Place Colette is in front of the Commedia Française, and I find that the place in front of the fantastic theater at the Commedia Française is appropriate that it's named after Colette. They probably named the square Colette because she's one of France's greatest writers. She lived in the Palais Royal for a while, but I find that it's important because Colette was a mime. In the beginning of the 1900s, she earned her living as a mime. She toured France as a mime. She even wrote a book about her experiences as a mime, The Vagabond. So, to me, having the place in front of the Commedia Française named Colette is very important. Now, the theater is also an important part of the history of mime, because we mentioned about Pierrot walking out on a stage in 1665. This is the theater. This is where Pierrot was first seen, here on this stage. A couple of centuries later, another important part in the history of mime took place. They were doing the production, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they wanted to do a hand-to-hand combat scene. And they asked Etienne de Creux, the father of modern mime, and his first pupil, Jean-Louis Barrault, to create a production in mime of hand-to-hand combat. They did, and it was in the production. Today we call that ancient combat. Now we're going to walk down past the Palais Royal and take a left to number 11. And this is a place that has nothing to do with mime directly, but it has to do with magic. In the middle of the 1800s, a magician, Robert Houdin, presented his soirée fantastique in this space. Robert Houdin is considered the father of modern magic because he changed the costume, he changed the kind of magic that was being done. and this is the space where he did it. A young man, a couple of decades later, in Wisconsin, by the name of Eric Weiss, decided to become a magician. And he decided to change his name. He took Robin Houdin's name, the last part, Houdin, added an I, and became Houdini. Now, a couple of decades later, another magician moved into this same space to do his magic show. And eventually, he filmed his magic show. And in filming it, he let trick photography do some of the magic. That was George Méliès, and he became a pioneer in the history of cinema. And silent film actors who could do mime had a unique advantage in doing the silent films. So now we're going to take another walk, a couple of blocks, and we come to the Place des Victoires. And in the middle of this place is a statue of the King, Louis XIV. He plays a very important part in the history of mime. One, he was instrumental in having Commedia dell'arte companies come to Paris because he liked the Commedia dell'arte. He was king when Pierrot was born. He is also the king who kicked the Commedia dell'arte out of Paris, out of France, and with it mime, in 1697. Now, down the street, down Rue Etienne Marcel, is the theater, the Hotel Bourgogne, where the Commedia Italienne performed, and they became an important part in the history of mime. And here's where the theater was. There's a plaque on the second floor that talks about the history of the theater. It was built in 1548, and it was torn down in 1783. And the late 1600s is most important to the development of mime. Now, the character, Pierrot, was played by Giuseppe Giottone. And after the success of Don Juan, several years later, a Commedia company decided to do a parody of the production, and they hired Giuseppe Giottone to play the part of Pierrot. And when that production finished, Giottone came to this theater and said, let me play Pierrot here. And they did. And everything was fine. But in 1684, they presented a play that changed everything again. They presented Harlequin, or the Emperor of the Moon. Pierrot had a very important part in this production. And the production became a huge success. Everybody wanted to see it, and Pierrot became a major character in the Commedia dell'arte as a result of this production. I wonder, Pierrot today is often associated with the moon. And here we have a production that elevated Pierrot into an important Commedia character, and its name is Harlequin, or the Emperor of the Moon. I wonder if that association first began with this production. For an actor who created the character of Pierrot, who made it popular so that the character would survive and become an important part of the history of theater and mime, we know so very little about him. We know that he was born in Italy in 1639. We know he came to Paris before 1665. We know he married a wealthy woman who lived outside of Paris. We know that when the king kicked the Commedia out in 1697, he just moved to his home outside of Paris. We don't know where that home was. We don't know when he died. We don't know where he is buried. We don't know anything else about this most important mime actor. Nothing. Now, the second person from this theater that we need to talk about is Dominique Bianculli. He played the part of Harlequin and was renowned for his ability to do mime, and the audiences absolutely loved him. When he died in 1688, his importance was such that they closed the theater for an entire month, and the people of Paris wrote epitaphs and poems to his greatness, to his ability to perform, his ability as a mime. And the last is Tiberio Fiorelli, and he played the part of Scaramouche and changed the character as well. Scaramouche never spoke on stage, and Fiorelli took the mask off, put on white face, gave him a little mustache and a little goatee, and created a sensation. There's a story that Fiorelli kept an audience laughing for 15 minutes and never spoke a word. And he died in 1694. Fiorelli and Bianculli are buried in a church not far from the theater, so let's take a walk down there. This is the church Eustache, and they are buried inside. And several years ago, Laurie and I decided to pay homage to these two great mimes. And we went into the church. We knew that they were buried in an alcove to the left of the altar. We began looking at the alcoves. There's a plaque next to each alcove that lists the name of the people buried in the alcove. We couldn't find Fiorelli. We couldn't find Bianculli. There was a docent, so we asked where these two people are buried. She looked on her sheet. They weren't listed. I said, no, the research couldn't be wrong. They're supposed to be buried here. We decided to look one more time. We looked and we looked and we went to the... There they were. Bianculli is not listed. Fiorelli is not listed. Harlequin is listed. And Scaramouche is listed. We had found them under their character names. Well, this is our journey, but I want to bring Molière back into the story, because when Molière died in 1673, he wanted to be buried in this church. And they said, no, we cannot have an actor being buried in our church. Two mimes, that's okay. An actor, no. So they buried him in another cemetery temporarily while they built a fitting memorial to Molière in Père Lachaise. And we paid homage to that memorial. And it's a much more fitting memorial than if he had been buried in the church. To have one of the world's most famous playwrights, a monument like this is much better than having a nondescript grave in some alcove of a church. So that is the end of our journey. And thanks to Google Maps, we can give you a footpath of where we went from the Fountain Molière to Place Colette, to the theater of Robert Houdin, to the statue of Louis XIV, to the Hotel Bourgogne, and finally to the Church of Saint Eustache. I thank you very much for joining us on this little journey. Goodbye.